tonight to help us discuss the issue of the graduate record exam, the GRE, in PIBS admissions. I really appreciate your taking the time to show up for this, and I also appreciate all of the effort that you've done reaching out to me, sending me information, and especially for the two teams who volunteered to give their best arguments either for or against the use of the GRE in Ph.D. admissions. Before we really get into it, I want to spend just a few seconds talking about PIBS, because this town hall is going to be on the internet. It's being live streamed right now. So for people who are watching who don't know what PIBS is, I'll just take a second to explain that. PIBS stands for the Program of Biomedical Sciences. It is an umbrella admissions and recruitment program. It's housed in the medical school, but it serves 14 different PhD programs that are listed here, most of which are at the medical school here at the University of Michigan, but some of which are not. Some of them are two of them are in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. It's a very diverse group, as you can see, not just by research subject, but also in terms of size, in terms of training style and structure. Some are departmentally based programs, while others are large interdepartmental programs. Some are supported by NIH training grants, and some are not. So it's a diverse group. But PIBS is the umbrella for the purposes of admissions and recruitment that contains all of them. And when you apply to PIBS, you're actually applying to all of these PhD programs. And in principle, at least, a student who is accepted into PIBS, joins us here, can join any of those 14 PhD programs, which include over 500 research labs. So it's a big, diverse group. PIBS, as I've said, it coordinates and oversees admissions and recruitment for those programs, and it also oversees the first year for those students while they're doing rotations and taking classes. We advise them, we participate a little bit in their training, and make sure that they end up in a good lab at the end of their 10 months of rotation. We also, through support from the medical school, fund the first 10 months of PIBS students' time here at U of M. Okay. So, for anyone who has been involved in admissions at all, at any time, the GRE is always a very interesting subject of conversation. It always comes up. And there are always strong opinions on all sides having to do with the GRE. This has always been the case as long as I've been involved in admissions, which is a pretty long time at this point. And the conversations seem to have been heating up lately. And so for those who wonder why we're talking about the GRE now, why are we talking about it in the summer of 2017, that's part of the reason, is that it's just being talked about more. Now, why is that? I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that there are, in the past 3 years or so, there have been a series of scholarly papers on the effectiveness of the GRE that have come out that have got people talking, although I don't know how many of us have read those papers. In addition, here at the University of Michigan, and I hope and think across the country, there's more of an emphasis on diversity and inclusion, especially where admissions is concerned. And concerns have been raised about the potential bias in the GRE scores. There have been arguments that I hope you've all taken a look at, that the GRE systematically underscores women and applicants from underrepresented minority groups, which, if true, would be a concern for our mission to recruit both an excellent and a diverse class of trainees. Now, if you look at the papers, and you've all had a chance to look at some of the papers, you'll see that there is evidence, there are papers arguing on both sides of this issue. And that makes it hard. I mean, it's always an easy decision to make when all the evidence is on one side. But that's not the case here. We have evidence on both sides. But, you know, we're scientists, and this is what we suit up for. And that's not an insurmountable problem. It happens in science all the time. And part of the purpose of this process is to examine that evidence and not simply throw up our hands and say, well, it's a 50-50 proposition, but really try to achieve some sort of consensus, although that may be too strong a word, about the value and benefits and potential dangers of the GRE. So why this particular process, this convoluted, complicated process that we've been going through this summer? Why have I been peppering you with emails about this for the last couple of months? Well, the reason is that although many of us have opinions about the GRE, almost all of us have opinions about the GRE as far as I can tell, sometimes very strong opinions. Very often, on both sides, when you really ask someone, well, why do you think that? You don't get much of an answer. A lot of us, even those who work in admissions, this isn't true of everyone, but a lot of us who work in admissions haven't read all the relevant papers. So I decided that for me, at least, in considering this problem, I needed some education, and I thought maybe as a community, we could stand to learn more about the GRE before we talk about what to do about it. So I put out a call to the PIBS faculty, and I asked for volunteers to form teams that are either for the use of the GRE requirement as a requirement in PhD admissions, or against that requirement, the pro team and the con team. I got plenty of volunteers on both sides, and I'm really grateful to those faculty and some staff who stepped forward to do that. Those groups, then I asked them to write a brief white paper for or against the GRE. Brief because I wanted everyone in our community to be able to read it without too much inconvenience. So I asked them to limit it to 1,000 words with unlimited references and unlimited figures. So then I posted those white papers on the web, and you all got the link, which is right here for those who haven't seen it. There's a Google Doc that contains those arguments. So the idea was for those of us in our community who are both trainers and trainees who are interested in this issue to read these white papers, to do research on their own, and also to look at the literature that's been pointed out by those pro and con teams. So I also shared a folder, a Google Drive folder, that contains a lot of the papers, both peer-reviewed scholarship and opinion pieces that were referred to by those teams. So these links will stay up indefinitely, and you're free to check those out. If there's something you would like me to add to that folder, please let me know, and I'll be sure to do it. The next step is, having hopefully read those white papers, that we come together now and debate, not formally debate, but kick these ideas around now that we're all familiar with the best arguments for and against the use of the GRE. We have representatives of both the pro and con teams here that would both like to make a short statement, and that's what we'll get to very soon. But I also have a mic here, and I'd love to hear the opinion of anybody who wants to pitch something in that they feel hasn't been really fairly considered up to this point. There are many, many perspectives on the GRE, I know, and I'd like to hear as many of them as possible. I'd like to bring up the pro and con teams to give some statements, but before that, I want to ask you, I happen to have a little bit of never before seen data, and I'm kind of jealous of the pro and con groups, and I wanted to get in on the act and show you some data myself. So before we get on with the discussion, would you like to see some data?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I have two things to show you. So first is a survey that I did of a group called, oh, actually, you know what, I forgot. Before we get into that, I'd like to ask you some questions and collect even more data. So for those of you who have, oops, it's locked. For those of you who have web devices on you, if you would be so kind, I just have a couple questions for you. If you would be so kind as to go to poleb.com/PIBS, you will see a question there for you, and the question is: before this summer, that is before we start talking about this in the PIBS community, how many scholarly papers on the GRE had you read? This is an anonymous poll, so you can be totally honest here, and I hope that you will. I'm just curious. Before this whole thing started, how many papers on the GRE had you read? I'll give you a minute to find the site. For me, it was probably 2, I would say, from beginning to end, and I've been working in admissions for a long time, if that helps. I'm from before this process started back in the spring to right now, and then I will take your temperature again at the end of this discussion. And the purpose is to find out whether, basically, whether opinions can be changed by information. As you know, as many of you probably know, there's good social science showing that people's opinions, when confronted with contradictory information, people's opinions don't change. In fact, the opposite happens. They dig in. As far as I understand, the evidence for that is very strong. So that's discouraging. But on the other hand, those studies were done on civilians. We're scientists, and I wonder if we can maybe do a little bit better than that. So we're going to find out. Okay. So the next question is, did you read at least one of the PIBS white papers on the GRE? Yes, skimmed it, or no? Okay. That's good. So we're all familiar with the basic arguments. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. As of right now, how many papers on the GRE have you read? And I would include the white. I would count the white papers as one. Oh, great. Okay, so many of you actually went to the references and read those papers. I'm so happy to hear that. Okay. All right. For this question, I'm not going to reveal the answers until the end. But back in the spring, before this whole process started, right? Say in May, what was your opinion about the GRE? The GRE should be required for PIBS admissions. The GRE should not be required, or no opinion. I'm not showing this right now, the results right now, because this is not a scientific sample of our community, and I wouldn't want, if the results are really one way or the other, predominantly, I wouldn't want that to kind of affect the discussion that we're about to have. Okay. Great, thank you. And last one. Right at this moment, what is your opinion of the GRE? I will tell you that fewer of you have no opinion, so that's good. All right, thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to show you some data that I collected from other people. So I have to tell you about something called the GRE group, which is a part of the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges. Within that, there is a subgroup called the GRE group, which is basically PhD program directors and associate deans and people like that who oversee PhD training programs within medical schools across the country. Okay, so that's it's a very big group. And I'm a member of that group, and within the GRE group, we poll each other all the time to basically take the temperature across the country on various issues. So very recently, like within the last week, I polled that group on their opinions and policies on the use of the GRE, because I didn't really have a very strong sense of thinking about the GRE within PhD programs across the country. So I'll try to go quickly, because I don't want to take too much time. But I thought these were interesting and perhaps relevant to this discussion, so I will show you some of I think, the most important results. So the first question was, does your PhD program require applicants to provide GRE General Test scores? Almost everybody said yes. That's not too surprising. I'm aware of at least 2 programs across the country that I know for sure don't require the GRE, and they're both fairly new PhD programs. One is at Cold Spring Harbor Labs, the Watson School, and the other is the Stowers Institute. If there are others that you know of for sure that don't require the GRE, and I think those 2 programs never have required the GRE. If you know of others, please let me know. Does your program require a GRE subject test? This has changed over time. Very few programs now require a subject test. Within PIBS, the subject test requirement was dropped back in, I believe, 2010. Does your program use a GRE score cutoff? And the results were kind of half and half. Roughly half say they do, and roughly half say they don't. So for this yellow category right there are umbrella programs in which different programs have different requirements. Have concerns about the use of GRE scores in PhD admissions been discussed at your institution? Yes. Everybody's talking about this. And you're not supposed to read this, but I will be posting the results. I left an open text field after this saying any comments, and there's some really interesting and revealing comments in here. One thing that I thought was particularly interesting was that several programs pointed out that they'd like to discuss dropping the GRE requirement, but they can't because either the graduate school, the equivalent of our Rackham at their institution, forces all PhD programs to require the GRE, which I should say at U of M, Rackham dropped that requirement several years back when Janet Weiss was Rackham dean. Or several programs said they'd like to discuss dropping or changing the GRE requirements, but they can't because NIH training grants require GRE data for applicants. And in case any of you have that same opinion, let me point out that that's not true anymore. For NIH training grants, for NIH individual fellowships, and for NSF individual fellowships, the GRE data requirement has been dropped. So those barriers are gone. Another good reason why this is maybe a good time to at least discuss this. Okay, are there concrete plans to either change your program's GRE requirements or bring the question to a head in the near future? About 20% yes, the rest no. In your opinion, this is the big one. In your opinion, for these PhD program leaders, in your opinion, should GRE General Test scores be required for biomedical PhD admissions? I was pretty surprised to see that it's about half and half. 22 said yes, 21 said no. And this poll is still open, so we'll get more data as it goes on, but this is the last I've seen of it. So it's about half and half. Now for those who said yes, I then asked follow-up questions. And if they said no, then I asked them different follow-up questions, okay? So for those who said yes, GRE should be required, those 22 PhD program leaders, I then asked why, and I gave them a series of options to check, and they could check as many as they wanted, okay? So these are some reasons I have heard for using the GRE, right? And then I gave an other category. The first reason, valuable as a predictor of success in graduate school, nobody chose that. Provides an objective, standardized measure of ability, 10 out of 22 selected that. But one said measures abilities that are relevant for PhD trade use. The biggest category was useful for screening out students below a certain level of ability. 2 said a reliable, 2 out of 22 said reliable indicator of quantitative skills, and 7 said other. So if you said other, you got a text box which you could fill in, and these are those 7 responses. I will let you look at them. Actually, I'll read them to you, because otherwise I'll be bored up here. They are beneficial if used with other indicators. Keep open the option that a better test might be devised. It is a standardized and not always reliable indicator of quantitative skills. It affords the program an opportunity to see if a student may need help with buttressing quantitative skills. However, it should not be an admissions criterion, and there should be no arbitrary cutoff. It indicates the applicant is serious. It can be useful for identifying exceptional students. It is a useful part of a holistic approach to admissions, and it shows that the student has made some effort to apply beyond completing the application. So those are the reasons that I got why the GRE should be kept as a requirement for PhD admissions. Okay, so now for those who said no, it should not be required, they had these options to choose from. Of those 21 who said no, the GRE is a poor or reliable predictor of success in graduate school. 100% of those 21 said yes. Concerns about bias against underrepresented groups of applicants, 90% of those said yes. Concerns about cost and equal access to testing facilities and test prep, 2/3 said yes. Does not measure abilities that are relevant, 13 out of 21 said yes. And other, there was one person who said other, and that other was scares away some applicants. Okay, so those are the reasons out there for or against. If you said no, then I asked you, well, if the GRE should not be required, should it be accepted and the scores shared with admissions committees if the applicant chooses to submit them? And of those 21, about, I think, just, what is that, 62% said yes, they should be accepted but not required. Okay? All right, so those are the data I have on peers across the country. Now I want to show some data on from trainees. So this is a study much like the studies that you've already read, but this one happens to be unpublished. A colleague, Nancy Street, an associate dean at UT Southwestern Medical Center, heard about this discussion that we're having, and she sent me some data from an as yet unpublished study that I thought I would share with you. I thought it was interesting and relevant. So, thank you, Nancy, for sharing these data. So they looked at, in this study, they looked at 183 PhD students over a several-year period. And the metric of success, which is always a tricky thing to determine, and it's always a source of criticism for these studies. How do you measure, if you're going to correlate any score on a test with success, how do you measure success, right? It's not easy. What they did here, which is similar to what's been done in other studies in the past, is they asked, at the time of the student's thesis defense, they asked their dissertation committee to rank them on a scale of 1 to 5, I believe, of success, right? So this kind of fudges the question because it leaves up to the faculty member, how do they define success, right? I will say that somehow they managed to get the faculty to use the whole range, as you'll see, and I believe the median score was 2.5 in this data set, so that was surprising to me, but they seem to have, for this kind of data, what looked like fairly decent data. So on the y-axis here we have those post-graduation ranking marks for those 183 students. On the x-axis we have several different GRE measures. The first is the GRE verbal score, and this is what the data look like. I don't know what you would guess the correlation here is, but it is 0.05. Does everybody here know about coefficient of correlation? I'm not a big stats guy, but this is a metric that measures basically how linear a relationship between two sets of variables are. So if they fall on a straight line with a positive slope, that is an R of 1. If they fall on a straight line with a negative slope, that's an R of -1. And if there's no correlation, it's an R of 0. Okay? So this would be considered I believe, sorry?
What is the y-axis? What is ranking mean exactly?
This is the scores that the members of the students' dissertation committees gave the student after their graduation. And I don't know, I haven't seen a written study here, so I don't know exactly how they were asked, but they were basically, rank this student on a scale of 1 to 5. So that is definitely a caveat to these kinds of studies, right? Because that is a subjective measure, no question. If you look at the quantitative GREs, you can see that they have very few students below a certain GRE score. This is the old style GRE measurement that went from 200 to 800. Right? Let me point out, this is a program that says they don't use cutoffs, but I'm not so sure about that looking at these quantitative data. But in any case, there is I wouldn't make too much of the negative slope here because 0.22 is still a pretty low number. Okay. But let's just say there's not a strong positive correlation in this data set. If you add so they also looked at adding those two scores together, and in case students compensate with a low score here and a high score, low on the verbal, high on the quantitative, adding them together doesn't seem to make much of a difference. And then finally, they didn't have a ton of students who took a subject test, but they also looked at that, and those students who took a subject test, they didn't find a correlation. So that's what I have, and just throw that on the pile with all the other studies that you've read up to this point. So now what I'd like to do is ask the pro team and the con team to come up and give a short statement. I think it kind of matters in a semi-debate format who goes first, so I thought I would flip a coin to see which team gets to go first. This is a special coin that was given to me by Kate Barral. She actually made it. It's a recruitment tool. It's a coin that is used to help students decide where to go to graduate school. It's got the block M on one side and the seal of the University of Michigan on the other. So I think I will ask Steve on the pro team to call block M or seal.
Block M or seal.
And I'll flip the coin, and then if you win, you get to decide whether you want to go first or second. What do you say?
Oh, I would say block M.
Block M it is. You want to go first?
Why not? Yeah.
Okay. So Steve Ragsdale wants to show some slides and give a summary of the pro team's arguments.
I never lose a coin toss, so that's an unfortunate thing. Can everyone hear me okay here? The back of the room? Okay, cool. Thank you. Well, thanks, Scott, for getting everyone together for this, and I'm happy to share some of the thoughts from the pro team. So probably a lot of us have been on admissions committees, and it's a really difficult decision, actually, when you see a bunch of really amazing-looking applicants, and we have all these different criteria that we want to use and as a sort of balance to decide yes or no on a particular application. And we've all been faced with that sort of situation where, we have these multiple criteria. They're all the different types of criteria. And they come in different colors. Sorry, I tend to walk away. Is this okay? I will. I've got to hold it while I'm talking.
No, it should be okay now.
Is this okay now?
Yeah.
So the different criteria, they come in metaphorically in different colors and different shapes. And they're often criteria that are offsetting, and that's why I feel like, and we feel like, as much information that we have available to us is really important. So for example, sometimes we'll see something that looks like, well, this particular criterion is really poor for that student. And then we look and balance that against some other criterion that looks really good. And so, for most of us, at least those of us on the pro team, and those of us in graduate admissions committees that I've served on for the last 30 years, have enjoyed having a wide variety of information. And it's important not only for saying, I want the best student quantitatively, but in terms of diversity, which is something that has been stressed in both teams' arguments, that in terms of diversity, it really helps to be able to look at all the various parameters. And when you're looking at diversity in sort of a broad state, then it helps to have as much information as possible, and especially quantitative information that allows us to make what we feel is, in the end, the best decision for the program and for the particular student. So that's an admission decision. But in addition, let's say the student's admitted, these data are also really important as the student decides on what laboratory they want to go to, and as their advisors and their mentors look at that information, and they really want to see, well, what's really best for the student is there. Like if we see something that looks like a stop signal, and we've admitted them anyway, then it might indicate that that we want to shore up some of their skills. So having quantitative information, let's say a really low quantitative GRE, then we might want to supplement some of their training, or low verbal, or a low writing score. We might be able to supplement that information. And so I've certainly used that in my own laboratory to help students and to help decide exactly what's best for that student for the long term, and to make them successful in their career. So that's just an overview of this process. And so in terms of this particular, the details of this particular discussion, I've just listed a few points. And I want to make this quick because I want this, we want the discussion to be broad, and to not just have me speak, but just to introduce a few of the points that we feel are important that support the use of the GRE. And so the admission decision is indeed a holistic and multi-criterion evaluation. And at least in no program I've ever been involved in have we used any simple numerical cutoff to say, oh, for this student, let's just throw out everything below a certain score. No one has done that, and we don't do that. I don't know of any PIBS program that does that, even though there are indications that there are programs that say if you have a score of 310 or below, then you're out. But we don't use that, and the pro team, as far as I know, we don't support that use of the GRE. We use it as one of the criteria that are shown here on this balance scale. And there are quite a few of those criteria. And I feel like the removal of any one of those criteria actually weakens the possibility of having a diverse and a strong graduate student. At least our graduate students, we want to have as diverse and as strong a group as we can. So having this broad range of criteria, that helps in recruiting a diverse graduate student body. It also helps us in identifying some particular individual strengths and weaknesses of each student who's being evaluated and who ends up in our program. Another really important criterion is that the GRE is the most, and at this point is our only standardized measure of evaluation across institutions. GRE also is indeed a useful predictor of subsequent performance in graduate school. And there'll be some discussion about this, I'm sure, because there's data on both sides. But I'm saying based on the strongest peer-reviewed studies. And one particular aspect of this that's been really important in graduate committees that I've served on is that they often save students with low GPAs, and we know of a number of cases where a student comes in, does really poorly at the beginning of their their undergraduate program, their GPA still doesn't rise to the point of being a 3.9. And so without a strong GRE, we might discard those students who are sitting in the 3.2 overall GPA range. So I think that's really valuable, and also someone with low GREs can be offset by other criteria. Again, it's a holistic evaluation that takes place. And so one way to look at this is just thinking about, we're all scientists here. And unless the GRE scores contain zero useful information, like everybody says, there's no point in having GREs. There's nothing of any use in that data. Then there's really no rationale to deny faculty the information that they contain. And we feel that if you omit the GRE scores, then you're actually compromising the identification of promising students. So there are a lot of things that can be said about each of these points, and those are not things that I'm going to do now, but I want us to just keep these things in mind, as well as whatever the CON team has to say as we proceed in this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. So now Beth Moore from the CON anti-GRE team will give her statement. And you asked me to bring up the way. Okay.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Beth Moore. Since this is going out across the country, I'm currently the director of the immunology program here at the University of Michigan. And I've been involved actively in recruiting for the immunology program for the past 15 years. And maybe just one disclosure, I was probably in that data set from UT Southwestern since that's where I did my PhD work. So I guess maybe the most important thing, let me see if I can just pull this up. This is the one figure that I wanted to make available to you. So I'll just try to summarize the arguments that a group of us came up with for the CON argument. And I think maybe the most important thing to start off with is just to admit that admissions decisions are very difficult. It's a really complex problem. We're trying to take a few data points and predict who will be successful in their career and who's best matched for graduate education. And that's really a complex problem. And I think because we're all scientists, we're all very eager to have data points that we can use to try to inform that decision, because we really want our metrics to be able to have predictive power. And I guess that our strongest argument against the GRE is that we really feel that that particular test does not offer any predictive power over other measures that we have to be able to judge fitness for graduate education. That's really the crux of our argument. We feel like undergraduate GPA and the performance in particular courses at the undergraduate level are just as good of predictors as the GRE, and that those predictors don't come with the potential for bias that we feel the GRE offers, which is really based on this data, which I'll cover in just a second. And we also feel like the GRE really imposes a financial burden that is a disproportionate burden to members of underrepresented minorities and certain groups. We believe that the preponderance of data that has been looked at in studying students who have actually been admitted to graduate schools show that the GRE is a poor predictor of success. In the white paper from the pro team, you'll notice that they did cite one article by Kunzel and Hazlitt that looked at all admissions to graduate education. And they argued in that particular study that the GRE as well as GPA were both good predictors of success in graduate school. I guess what we would argue, and some of the criticism of the pro team's argument was that a lot of the studies that we cited were looking only at people who actually entered graduate school, and so there might have been some selection bias in the statistics of only looking at people who actually got in. I will point out that this data right here represents GRE scores and the quantitative and verbal portions of the GRE across a variety of ethnic groups, as you'll see, and this data is all comers. So this is not selected data based on people who actually got into graduate school. This is looking at the average test scores for people applying to graduate school in all fields. And I think it's pretty easy to see that this test shows a very poor performance for a number of underrepresented minority groups compared to whites. And I think that when you consider that President Schlissel has made diversity be really a cornerstone of what the University of Michigan stands for, and that a lot of what the University of Michigan has stood for over the years has been to value diversity in education. I will also point out that Steve Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote a book about thinking fast and slow, noted that that sometimes as experts, we have the fallacy of being able to take one or two data points and try to create a narrative where we think we can interpolate, extrapolate what somebody will, how somebody will perform based on those data points. And we just think that the GRE has the subject for too much bias and too much noise. And so while we know that it is a metric, we believe it's a flawed metric, and that's why we would argue to get rid of it, because we think we can really use a holistic review. We totally agree with the concept of using lots of pieces of information to try to make a holistic review of graduate education. I'll also point out that Scott Page, who's here in the business school, has done a lot of work to suggest that the power of diversity is important when the complexity of the problem is the biggest. And so I think when we're thinking about complex biological questions that we're trying to get our students to tackle and understand, that there's great value in having diversities of opinions and experiences in tackling those problems in the lab. And so that's one reason why we're really committed to diversity. I know the pro team is also committed to diversity. I think we just differ in how we view the use of the GRE in establishing that. I think they're arguing that you could use the GRE to pull up some students who might perform poorly in other areas to increase diversity. Our fear is that this data suggests that it is much more likely and a bigger risk that the GRE scores would disadvantage students from diverse backgrounds and might be more likely to bias us against even allowing those students to come in. So that is kind of the crux of our argument. I also want to make the point about the economic argument. We think that if we require the GRE, students are really going to feel pressure to prepare for the GRE course. In the white paper, we provided a lot of information about the cost of the prep classes. This is really just a disproportionate burden for a lot of students from underrepresented minority backgrounds or for poor resourced backgrounds. And we would like to eliminate that burden or that barrier to admission. I guess finally the last thing we'll say is that we just don't believe that the GRE, which tests math at a high school level, is really a measure that we think is highly valuable for predicting who will be the best in graduate school. I think that we feel like the ability to look at letters of recommendation, students' research statements, and really the interview. I cannot stress how important we think that the interactions of the students when they come and interview with the faculty, that we think that that gives us our best data with which to use a holistic evaluation. Certainly in the immunology program, we have tried to devalue GRE scores over the last many years. We did not look at them at all in our applicant pool last year, and we feel like we've still continued to recruit outstanding students. And I guess the last point that I'll just make before we open it up for questions is that in my 15-year history in the immunology program, really being involved in decisions, I just know of a lot of students who had very poor GRE scores, but who have been amazing scientists and who have gone on to be highly, highly successful. And so we just feel that our experience suggests that it's not a very useful measure. So with that, I'll just stop and I'll let Scott open this up for other questions.
Okay, thanks so much to steep and death for that. Now we will open things up for any of your comments, questions, anything at all. I'd really like to hear opinions of those who came here today. Okay, let me run up to you with the mic.
I can shout.
You can shout? Okay, I'll repeat your question.
Can you, before we begin, it seems like the potential for bias is one of the major concerns here. Can you tell us the magnitude of the potential problem by saying, what percentage of applicants fall into URM categories? For those of us who don't have the latest data on admissions, how large of a potential effect and group is it in terms of the overall number of applicants?
Can we break the problem down by how do, are you talking about with our own internal
Right,
data?
what is the magnitude of the potential for bias? I guess what I'm asking. Are we talking about 5% applicants, 10% of the applicants that would fall into categories that have, say, historically done poorly on the test?
What's the magnitude of the supposed risk to diversity? I think I'm going to throw this to the pro team, see if they have a response to that, or the con team, excuse me.
I think what he was asking. Okay, I'm not sure if I understand. I think what you were asking is what percentage of our applicants come from underrepresented backgrounds?
29%.
I was gonna say, at least in the immunology program, it's historically been around 30%. I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
And 35% at our highest and 29% overall in PIBS. So we think that's a substantial fraction.
And what about male, female, since that's?
Yeah, that's true, male, female. I think our PIBS applicant was
60-40.
60-40 female to male.
Yeah.
And females are disadvantaged on the GRE based on this data as well.
Scott, following up on that question, I think that PIBS gets a tremendous credit for success in recruiting a diverse student body. I think we're remarkable. I think it's about 20% underrepresented minorities. 30%, which I think nationally is quite outstanding. And so to me, that argues that using the GRE along with these other measures is working for us. And the bias is only a problem if one has a cutoff that applies to all groups. If you're comparing across groups and there's a difference in performance in groups, then you have a problem. But if you're taking that into account, along with the other measures that we're using, then I think it's clear that it's working.
Thanks, Mary. Any other comments about that?
Hi, Dave Anthony, I'm in the CMB physiology programs. First, I want to thank Scott for doing such a great job of doing such a thoughtful process. This is great. My question is really, I don't have a defined opinion yet, but I'd like to ask the GRE team. So we just had our bias training, unconscious bias training, and the bottom line of that was there is no case where there's no bias. You need to recognize bias and then work on it.
You mean every part of any measure of a student?
And in this case, any measure of a student might carry a bias. And so one could actually argue the opposite. At least the GRE is actively assessing that degree of bias. And there's a chance that we can understand that when we look at the GRE scores, and there's a chance that we can work towards improving this test. Certainly, if we move towards GPA, we're looking at the biases carried by undergraduate professors all over the country. So again, with the idea of reducing the amount of information, I just wonder if you have thoughts about the fact that there are certainly other biases, or the biases of going to Stanford versus my alma mater, Daysburg College, and so there's bias at every step, and some of them seem to be much worse than the GRE bias.
Right, I'm happy to respond to that. You're absolutely right. There is the potential for bias at every level. I mean, letters of recommendation can show bias. Certainly, undergraduate institutions. You're right. So it's not. It is difficult to eliminate bias. I think it's practically impossible to eliminate bias. I guess again, my argument would be that the GRE not only introduces the potential of bias, but I believe it actually imposes a financial burden as well. So those other metrics are things that the students are going to have to do one way or the other, but the GRE is an optional thing that we can ask for. And so the cost of the, I can't, we were really motivated in our group. We talked a lot about students. We've known of stories of students who have pay to take those prep courses multiple times in an effort to try to get their scores increased. And the testing service will only send a score to 4 schools initially. And for every school above and beyond that, there's an additional cost. And then if you take the prep again, and a lot of times for students who are coming from, say, rural areas or from Puerto Rico and things, we've known of students who've paid to fly to another location to be able to take the test, been up, on all night on bus rides to be able to take the test and things. And then of course their performance doesn't necessarily change. Now I agree with what I think you're saying is that if we ourselves are aware of the bias, we can look at these scores with some filter that will allow us to see them more clearly. But I'm still very, very worried. I can tell you that the reason we went in immunology to not showing the scores at all to begin with is because it's hard when the first thing we used to have on our PIBS page was we would have the GPAs, the schools they were from, and the GRE scores right there. Before you've ever opened up the application and even read the student's statement or their research statement or their letters of recommendations or anything, the first number that hits you is GPA and GRE scores. And I think it's hard for us to not be biased by a low score. I think it's just human nature to feel like somebody that, a score that falls in the less than the 50th percentile in some measure is a real problem. And yet, we know of examples of students who've had scores in the less than 50th percentile. I stand before you as a endowed professor at the University of Michigan who had a verbal score less than the 50th percentile, and I'm not the only one in the room. I just don't think it's a measure that is accurate. I understand the request for data, but I believe that the financial burden that the GRE imposes on certain students is really substantial, and I would like to remove that barrier to application because I believe we have other metrics that we can use to glean the same information.
Steve, you want to say anything?
Yeah, please.
I think I wanted to go back to what you said and stress that because we had some discussion about that as well. None of this discussion goes about how biased or unpredictable the other values are. Some of the papers that the con team provided stated with ends of like 100 or 200 stated that letters of recommendation, faculty review, and undergraduate GPA were equally non-predictive to the graduate school. So we feel, what Scott said, that this is part of the equation, but there are situations where some of the other measures are even more biased. So for example, my program recruits nearly 50% international students. And I can tell you a letter of recommendation from India, from Britain, from China, and from America are very, very different beasts. And so we have to be aware. We are not looking at them the same way as if all the letters were the same. You can't. And so there is bias in all these other measures as well, and we know also, just like your example, of students in our program who came in with an undergraduate GPA of 2.5 or 2.8, and honestly, if I didn't have the GRE to sort of balance that number of value, I'm not sure whether we could have admitted them, but knowing that there is the potential in this student, plus of course all the other things, the letters, etc., make these good, successful students. And so I think part of the discussion is the GRE not, is it biased or flawed? Is it so much more biased and more flawed than all the other measures? And that's where we feel the other measures have their problems too, and having all kinds of measures is what helps.
See the hand back there. And then, a couple of hands. And let me hear some comments from trainees.
Thanks. Margaret, I understand your point because I have probably spent close to 40 years reading letters from applicants to the medical school and to our department, certainly. I would have to say that the GRE has been a very mixed bag over all of the years that I've been reviewing applicants. Originally, we did see excellent GRE scores from American applicants and terrible ones from foreign applicants. Then it switched. Then the verbal, for instance, from the American applicants was incredibly low, and from the Asian applicants, it was zooming through the ceiling. And in those years that I have been reviewing, I have seen so many applicants that had terrible GRE scores but were perfect lab rats, and ones that had great GRE scores, did well on the classes, and looked at a lab bench like it was a foreign object. So actually, I would like to see the data that the letters of recommendation and all of the other things are non-predictive. Because in all my years, some of those things have been the very best, and the experience that the student has had in the laboratory has been more predictive than anything, in my experience.
Hi, I'm Jens Ward. My main appointment is chemistry. In chemistry, we haven't used GREs in about 8 or 9 years, and we have not regretted it. I think the biggest problem is overall that there's a very high risk that they are used effectively as a cutoff. Of course, programs say we don't have a cutoff, but the committee sits together. If one committee member says, I don't think this student hits the bar, that student is out in a competitive admissions process. And if one person just has that sense that, well, this number looks low, it's just very tempting to use that openly or less openly in the discussion.
I'm a third-year graduate student in MCD. I'm interested from a student's perspective. I understand the experiment and I understand the results that we get, but what is the question that we're asking with the GRE?
Does anybody want to tackle that?
When you're asking what is the question that we're asking, are you talking about the process that we're in right now? The question about whether we remove the GRE from consideration.
What does the GRE answer for us? We get these results, we get a quantitative score for quantum, the verbal, but what question are we asking?
You mean in the admission process?
No,
In the GRE,
What
with
does
this test.
what does the GRE test really, what does it answer?
What does it
tell
tell
us?
us?
And so there are various criteria within the GRE. And so there's a writing section. Used to be the old analytical section, because you wouldn't know about the old one. but anyway, there's a section where you're asked to evaluate various arguments. And it really is there to test your ability or your logical mastery that you develop as an undergrad. So you'll be supporting a particular argument through your discussion, and then there are usually 3 tests that are given for that, and then there is a verbal section where you are, it's really your command of the language. There's some grammar type things in there, understanding the grammar, understanding of, and so let's say someone scores really poorly. Let's say you have a 20th percentile in verbal. Then what I would do is I would look at that and think, well, okay, that student, I mean, we might then look at some of these, let's say look at their English literature courses and how they've done in their, at least in our admissions committee. We would look at their GPA and look at their more literature-based and writing-based scores and see if that's supported. So if they have, let's say, all their English courses, anything that has to do with analytical skills, logic skills, philosophy classes, if those are also very poor, then we would recognize that student's going to have a deficiency in those areas. And then we have to decide on the basis of all our criteria whether we want to take a risk on a student who looks from several of these criteria that deal with writing and literature, if they would be able to survive the program. Then, of course, I haven't mentioned there's also a quantitative section, which measures your ability to handle quantitative problems. And so for some labs, that's a really important indicator. Some programs, it's more important than in other programs. But again, it's even the GRE itself is a quantitative assessment. You get percentiles that compare each student across the board to all other students. And
Right, I guess my question more specifically is,
Yeah.
what does an ability to remember the rules for special triangles or understanding what the word magniloquent means in terms of my ability or any student's ability to be a successful scientist?
what it might indicate, if let's say that you are going into a program that is highly quantitative in nature, and if you look at your score, your GRE scores, your quantitative is really low, and we look at your calculus class, your algebra classes, and those are also very low, then we would worry about the student coming into that sort of program. At least if I was on that admissions committee. Of course, there are 6 of us sitting around the table, and everybody has their own opinion about what's going on, and everyone discusses this. And so it's again a the multiple criteria that we're looking at, but we want to make decisions that are going to be in the student's best interest as well as those in the program. And so specifically about rules of triangles, that may be one thing, but then across the board, if you see a particular problem with the handling of quantitative information, then that would be a source of concern.
Correct. So I think that we are all recognize that the admissions process is complex and is an imperfect science. We're trying to make some decisions based on incomplete and imperfect data or information. So we're trying to do the best that we can. And so I think that we all agree that and we are committed to a diverse and talented pool of student body. So I think that the question is how to best accomplish that. And so I think that getting as much information about an applicant is key, not only to identify those that are would be well suited for graduate school, but also to identify how to tailor their educational experience as best as we can to their particular profile. And so as much information we have about the students, that will help us to tailor that experience best. And the other thing that I want to say is that we share with the con team the question about the cost and that being as a barrier, and I think that's a concern. But I think that rather than eliminating the GRE, I think that it wouldn't be too difficult to reduce the barrier to access to the GRE. I think that Michigan can be in a leadership position by making sure that that's not a barrier for the people that are thinking to apply to Michigan. If that's made explicit in our application materials, that if getting the GRE or preparing for the GRE is a major obstacle for you, we will ensure that we can take steps to reduce that barrier to you. And so that would, in one way, facilitate access to the people that most need it, and 2, still give us the relevant data. And I just want to finish by saying that because this is an imperfect data, just like the weather prediction, short-term weather prediction is pretty iffy, 5 or 6 days down the line. And so the Europeans use a consensus model where they use multiple different prediction models, and then they build a consensus from that. And that's doing better than the US, who uses a single model, right? So I think that using consensus in these kinds of situations where you have different data or incomplete aspects, it's important to have as much information as possible. And I do think that the GRE captures something that other things don't capture.
I guess if I could just say, one of the things that we discussed is I think what we are opposed to is the requirement for the GRE. I don't think we have any problems with the situation that y'all are discussing where an applicant might have had poor undergraduate GPA, they take the GRE, they do well on it, and they want to submit that as an additional piece of information to consider in their particular case. I don't think we would have any problem with it being optional for a student to submit the GRE, we just don't want it required. And I would prefer, because I don't know logistically how the University of Michigan can provide access to the GRE prep classes for every applicant who wanted to apply to us. What I would prefer to see, and I do understand that for the quantitative disciplines, there may need to be some competency evaluation at some level, but I would prefer to see us come up with a 10 or 20 question exam that students applying to biophysics or bioinformatics or whatever, that they could take, that they don't have to pay for. They just take it when they interview, or they take it online before, as part of their application or something, so that we don't have that barrier. I mean, some other option like that, if you feel like you have to have that quantitative measure and that that's really valuable, I just think there may be some other way we could get that same information that would not present the bias and barrier that I feel the GRE does.
So I kind of want to second that. I don't have all this data, this is just a personal experience, but. Oh, sorry, I'm Melissa, I'm a second year human genetics graduate student. Third year it is. I have done well in math since middle school. I love it, I enjoyed it, I got good grades. In college I took a BC calculus test, I took the AP exam, I got a top score. When I went to study for the GRE, I was able to study because I had the money to buy a book, and I had a job that my family kind of helped introduce me to, so I had the time. And so like I said, I did really well in math throughout my coursework. I enjoyed it, and when I sat down to take the multiple practice tests available for the GRE, I did horribly in the math section, the quantitative section. I had to go back and I had to look up some triangles and I had to look up some basic statistics. But even after doing that, I still did poorly until I used the techniques in the book, which is a Kaplan validated book for taking the GRE. And what they taught me in that book that allowed me to get a near perfect score on the quantitative portion of the test was not how to answer the questions, because I can answer all of them almost perfectly. Given enough time, I could work them out. What they taught me to do was to rapidly evaluate the question, eliminate answers, use probability to move up or down from the middle question. So I wasn't doing math, I was leveraging test taking scores, and that doubled my score. So that's my personal experience.
So I agree with the university test, I think would be a much better evaluation.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is AJ Larkin. I've been here about a month. This question.
Welcome.
Thank you. This question is for the comm team, not to pick on them, but just something I noticed while going through the references. One of the references did a similar study to the one that we saw, where a panel of professors rated graduate students on a scale of, I don't even think they said if it was 1 to 5 or whatever, but they rated the students and then compared their GRE scores among other things. And it did find that the general GRE scores did not really correlate with success for the students. But surprisingly, one of the largest or greatest predictors of graduate student success was the GRE subject test. So how does the comm team feel about subject tests, and would this suggest that maybe instead of standardized tests being bad, would it just suggest that we're using the wrong type of test?
Right, so our group did talk about the subject test requirement quite a bit. So there's two basic problems with the subject test as a requirement. Again, I don't think we have any problem at all with optional submission of these scores. One problem is that there's not a subject test available in every discipline that we offer PhD degrees in. And certainly speaking as someone for the immunology program, we often have applicants who come from small liberal arts colleges where there's not even an immunology course offered. And so their interest in immunology comes from research experience and things like that. And so even if there were an immunology subject test, that not all students would be equally prepared to take that. And we feel that it's our responsibility, if we accept them as I guess this would go overall, we feel like if we accept a student as a graduate student at the University of Michigan, it's our responsibility, once that student gets here, to assess what their strengths and weaknesses are. That's really what a prelim is all about, is finding out what a student's strengths and weaknesses are. And we design the curriculum and the help to meet each student's individual goals. And we think we can do that better once they're here and we know what their strengths and weaknesses are than trying to predict it ahead of time. So, it's an imperfect science, we absolutely understand that. But the biggest problem with subject tests is that they don't have the breadth that we would need to cover all of our programs, and the ability for many students to prep for particular subject tests might be, there's not an immunology subject test, for instance. So.
Dan Michael from physiology. Since the optional score option was mentioned, I just wanted to say something strongly against that option. Because I would rather have the scores from everyone or the scores from no one. Because the optional option, what it creates is the students will know that the environment is very competitive to get into graduate school. There'll be a lot of pressure to still take the exam. And the assumption will be from the review panels is if they don't submit their score, that they didn't score very well.
Yeah.
When it could have been that they chose not to take it because of a financial reason.
Right.
I think it would be way more biased than having the scores from everyone. So I just want to say that.
I think that's fair. I agree, I agree with that too.
Yeah, I wanted to, thank you, I'm Jens Warden from chemistry. I wanted to make a couple of points about the difference between theory and practice. I totally agree. I've never taken the GRE, but coming from Germany, but what I've gathered is that in theory, of course, it does test math skills and verbal skills and all this. But in practice, it's mostly about test-taking skills. And this is general, the experience that we just heard about. I've heard many, many times from students. And think about this way: is that test-taking skill, that is being able to answer certain limited questions in a period of time where you sit with maybe dozens of people in a warehouse or so, and answering very specific questions in your cubicle, is that really a situation that you will ever encounter in graduate school? And that then will predict on how you will do in that situation in graduate school? I don't think so.
I hope not in my program.
Right, so that's, so again, if it really was a take-home exam, maybe some sort of, really intellectual exercise, and it was about that, I think it would test math-taking skills perhaps. But I think the way it's run, by necessity, it will test other things. And that is, I think, the reason why ultimately there are warehouses in China where students take these GA tests, they are prepped for it, they ace them. I don't think they perform, we admit them into our graduate programs, I don't think they perform any better than a domestic student with much lower GAE scores. So that experience of having gone through this in these warehouses with the prep courses in China, and really are prepped for it, and then ace all the scores, 21, whatever score, are not representative of ability in graduate school. I wanted to also add, so in chemistry, as I mentioned, we haven't used the GRE scores ever since Brecken started discouraging using them. And instead, what we do is we really scrutinize the grades. So we have discussions about, this GPA is good, but the student really seems bad at math and physics. Will that work for chemistry or physical science? And I think that actually integrates over a longer period of time, rather than a couple hours of exam testing, quantitative skills, for example, for a quantitative graduate program. And in my own experience, and I think there are some students who might have here, but so they should have closed their ears, but from my own experience, I've noticed that in my lab, which is quantitative biology based, I can correlate with GPA sometimes. So students that get a 3.5, 3.6 and better are performing better. That doesn't mean that they couldn't, any student couldn't be productive if you find the right project for them, right? But there is some correlation in terms of how many papers. And again, that goes back to the idea that the GPA, GRE to me, having used GPA instead of the GRE, really the GRE is redundant. If anything, then it's redundant with the GPA if you really use all the grades specifically and look at quantitative classes that you're taking.
Well, I'll just say that for most of the studies that we examined, there was no better correlation of the GRE with whatever the metric of success was than with GPA. So I think our basic crux of our argument was we thought that they were similar indices. But I will say that the GRE the SAT, all of those tests were originally described because with a 4.0 GPA, that's not a lot of room to discriminate between students, obviously. And so the hope was that to get something with a larger scale to give you better discrimination. But as we see, I think, you know, our philosophy is that it's, you know, still a flawed metric.
It's Greg Russell from pathology. You know, with respect to admissions, and I've been here 23 years or so, and I've done admissions over the course of that time. And it's really hard to distinguish between applicants, you know, and when we talk about GPA, you know, we all know that there's a great disparity in the quality of undergraduate education in this country. And sometimes kids come from schools that some of us have never even heard of, and some, you know, apply from Stanford or MIT. And, you know, the GRE, in my view, is really the only standardized countrywide metric. You know, for better or for worse, the biases we know about, we've already identified. You know, I agree with the first comment that it's better to have an identified bias than an unidentified bias. You know, but it's really the only standardized metric we have. And, you know, I find it ironic that we're in a room full of scientists arguing about whether we should have more data or less data. You know, last but not least, and I'll throw this out there, Scott, maybe this is an issue. Are we at all concerned about having GRE data available, that this might be potentially used against us if we're ever subject to, you know, being sued, or given the Trump administration and what they're doing now with respect to affirmative action? Is that a concern, that by not having this data available, it maybe gives us, it protects us from something like that?
That did occur to me. For sure. I think Pat's got something.
I've got one person up here, and then you're next.
Hi, my name is Naran Liu. I'm actually a recent grad of undergrad here. And I want to follow up to Dr. Dressler's point first, and say that while it may be the only standardized measure that we have across the country, we know that most standardizations are not unbiased, and that in terms of standardized testing, specifically, the ways that they score the tests and the kinds of questions that they select for future tests are based on students that have historically scored higher scores in the past. So there's kind of this systematic bias that's built into the testing structure. But the point that I was going to make separate from that is that we've been talking a lot about competency and talent in an applicant, and I think there's been some conversation in academia settings more recently about the idea of a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, and the idea that if we consider all of the different obstacles and barriers that students from different backgrounds may face prior to their graduate education, so for example, throughout middle school, throughout high school, throughout college even, what institution they may attend, what kinds of resources or research experiences and opportunities they may have available there, the kinds of faculty and the kinds of support in terms of mentorship and having representation in the faculty of people that look like them, people from backgrounds like them. So just thinking about all of these different barriers that may come across prior to a student entering their graduate education, might we consider the possibility that graduate training, you know, the 5-6 years or more of PhD training could be sufficient to prepare a student with potential, with motivation, with work ethic, to be a very successful member of the community, of the scientific community, even if they are not necessarily coming in at a level of, you know, a certain quantitative or verbal or whatever the GRE measures, competency or efficiency. And so I think that's a point that we want to consider as well, that, you know, even if we take a student and we measure values like motivation and passion and commitment and work ethic, things that cannot be measured by something like a GRE, and then put them, you know, we take a risk on in them, and we put them in a supportive environment in graduate school where they're enabled to flourish and develop these training and skills, might that be as effective?
Those are absolutely the students that the admissions committee are looking for. And the use of a number of criteria allows us to do that. And there are going to be times that GRE scores are low, there'll be times that particular letters are not reflective of some of the other letters or some of the other criteria. And so the use of multiple criteria is really important. So yes, there'll be, we don't want to be focusing just on the GRE, but there's certainly, there've been a lot of case studies or single data points presented about, well, okay, I had a low GRE and I did really well. Statistically, that is our statistical measure, and the best statistical studies out there, the widest population, the most numbers, support the GRE as being a good predictor of graduate success. So if some statisticians wanted to talk about that study that actually was not cited by the other team, then that would be welcome information. But there are case studies in various ways. There are people who've done really well on their GREs, and that saved them to bring them into graduate school. But whatever we're doing on the graduate committees is to identify those passionate students and students who have the right background and we feel like can be successful in the program. And so all these variables are really important. We just don't want to throw away one of them that does provide useful information both in the admissions process as well as in the students once they get in the programs.
I'm Pat Schloss, Department of Microbiology and Immunology. So I would take issue with the idea that we want to get rid of data. I mean, I want to get rid of bad data. And there's this issue of differentiating signal and noise. And from the literature, and looking at peer institutions, perhaps the best study that's out there at peer institutions is Vanderbilt's, published a year or two ago, where they have a similar program to PIBS. It's something like 500 students they tracked over 5 to 10 years, looking at a variety of outcomes. GRE had zero correlation with any of those metrics. Going back to the idea of the institution that the students come from, institution that the students came from didn't matter either. My best students have come from schools I've never heard of before. Heron College, Grand Valley State, I never heard of that. But you know, these schools, it doesn't matter, right? If you're in computational biology and you're looking at their quantitative score rather than their calculus scores, I suspect your graduate programs will have other problems. And so it really is an issue of signal and noise. And we can all say, well, I'm a scientist, I don't have to worry about bias, or I can correct bias. And all of the bias literature says that that's just not true. There are legendary studies of symphonies that are trying to recruit people to be part of their symphony. And when they don't put a veil in front of the stage, they basically get all men, right? So you put a veil up, the number of women that you get goes way up, right? Why is that? Because you're removing the noise of the person's gender, right? And so that's my belief, and I think our on-site belief, that we need to remove this noise of GRE. And sure, there's opportunities for bias with research experience and with letters, but there's also considerable signal there, right? There's a lot of bias in terms of racial and gender makeup with GRE, but there's no signal, right? There's no signal that you're trying to divine by getting through all that bias.
I guess one thing I'd say is that the Kunzel and Hazlitt article that was published in Science in 2007 that the Pro Team cites, I encourage you to read that article and also to read the commentaries. There are 3 commentaries that come after that article, 2 of which point out problems that particular people saw with the analysis, and then a response from the authors again. And I think it's really insightful. Again, I think we feel like the problem with that study, again, to remember, that is the largest study, but it also crosses all fields, humanities, social sciences, as well as biological sciences. And it has a comment in the article too that GPA also predicts as well as GRE scores. So that's really the crux of our argument there.
That's really an interesting paper that everybody really should, I think, check out, that Kunzel paper. And it gets at an issue that actually there's been a lot of talk about, which is restricted range. The restricted range problem, somebody on Twitter educated me about. The restricted range problem, as I understand it, is that if you look at graduate students in an institution like U of M, I see that hand in the Connect Gallery, and you're next. If you look at graduate students in a PhD program, that's a selected group. Those are the students that were accepted, right? So you're leaving out all those students who are not, who were not accepted, right, or didn't apply. And that is going to include a wider, by definition, because we use the GRE, it's going to include a wider range of GRE scores. So how do you get around that? You can't track the success of students in graduate school if they don't go to graduate school, right? So what do? It's an inherent limitation in the data. The Consol study actually uses something called a corrected correlation. That's what they publish in that figure. And I don't know exactly how that correction works. I couldn't figure it out I'm just not qualified to understand supplementary materials, but it does bump up the correlation numbers for all of those categories. It's just something that we have to deal with. It's an imperfection in our data set.
Yeah, one of Claire's real problems with that study was that it did not take into account the racial differences. It didn't look at students across racial barriers. That was all comers, where it was really swamped by majority students.
So I think we're also leaving out the socioeconomic status, which I think we need to faster than a quarterback.
I do want to point out the socioeconomic status because that is something that we as a committee find. It's a question for us, huh? Do we as an institution, knowing that we know, do these studies, and if we continue to require GRE, do these uphold our institutional values of diversity, equity, and inclusion? To me, that is in the forefront of what drove me to be a part of this con team. And it's a question that I think we all have, which is why we're here, which is why I'm so proud that we're here debating and intellectualizing. It challenges my moral imagination, and I'm so glad it challenges everyone else too.
Hi, my name is Jimmy Brancho. I just graduated from chemistry in May, and I'm working as a first-year faculty at the Sweden Writing Center. My GRE scores are trash. I just want to highlight two things. So we've been talking a lot about distinguishing between graduate school applicants, and I want to make sure that we're all appreciating the difference between people who get to apply and get to be considered in that process, and people who can't apply, who are so discouraged from applying by the process itself that they don't get to be part of that data set. And I think that's a really important distinction. And I also, as a second point, am not seeing the connection for how the GRE actually improves diverse participation in graduate school. If data is surfacing that shows that the GRE is tilted against people of a certain racial background, a certain socioeconomic background, or against people who don't grow up in English-speaking cultures, how do we reconcile that, having that as a requirement with a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And that's a point that I haven't heard completely enunciated by the pro side yet today.
Seeing Jimmy reminds me that I didn't mention that this town hall is being live tweeted, and after the meeting, if you want to go to the hashtag PIBS Talks GRE, one word, you'll see a lot of great discussion online about this. Sarah had a comment.
Hi, so I'm Sarah. I am going to be a fifth year in CMB, and kind of working off of what Pascal said and what that student just said. Let's say you're in a admissions committee meeting and you see a really fantastic GRE score from a white male, and then you see a mediocre bad GRE score from a minority female. If you know that there are these biases, you're going to say, well, we should take that into consideration. And at the end of the day, how is this different from not having that data point at all?
data that we have is for the people that were selected. And so that is not a very good indicator of the lack of correlation, or the weak correlation that requires large studies to really have enough power to see that argues that that's a significant part because of this selection bias, that you're just looking at the ones that were selected. The other thing that I should caution is that, as was mentioned by the COM team early on, is that we should be careful not to base our decisions on individual cases. We've heard several individual cases now, which argue that GRE scores are meaningless. But again, that's a selected a few examples from the people that were actually accepted to those programs. So to me, that's an indication that the admissions program was good enough to recognize that those scores were not necessarily in validation. And so the other point that I would make is that I think that the GRE scores for the scenarios where would the GRE score be useful? If you have a GRE score that is actually quite good from some person with a underrepresented minority or with certain difficult circumstances, that would give us a lot more weight to that score, right? Even if it's not off the charts, but if it's quite significantly above what you would expect from other students in that category, that could certainly outweigh other criteria in that applicant's portfolio.
I just remind you that this data, though, is not this is not for applicants who are into it. This is all applicants,
yes.
And it is so biased. I'm not comfortable with a piece of data that is so biased that I know that it predicts race and gender more than it predicts ability.
So just because the data is correlated with race, the performance is correlated with race and gender, that doesn't mean that that information is not useful.
I disagree. I do disagree with that. I think that means that's
it's
like having the ELISA data when the standard curve doesn't work.
No.
You have to throw it out.
No, that's not true. Race and background also affect other criteria that we use. So that just to pick on just the GRE because
But the GRE is something that is optional. We can't make undergraduate education optional. We can't make research experience optional. We can't make letters of recommendation optional. But the GRE is optional. So I do think we can control that.
I still think that you were losing information.
When we recognize these biases, and those are certainly well recognized within graduate admissions committees, and that is taken into account as we are evaluating the candidates.
Okay, I think this will be the last one.
Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Carney. I'm a second year in cancer biology. And I just wanted to make one really quick point. During my interview process, I'm not going to include the university, but let's just say that it became part of the actual interview process where she asked me about my GRE score. So I did really well on the quantitative, but my verbal was average. And her reasoning for asking it was just if you're reading a paper, how do you understand the figures, or if you're trying to understand the underlying meaning. And I told her it takes time to understand the science behind all the jargon, and definitely it is not a field that you're going into. But I thought it was really funny that she would focus on that instead of actually reading my application. So she was one of the few faculty members that didn't know that was coming from veterinary kind of interest. And I actually worked in a veterinary school, and now I was doing research with neurons, and trying to make a connection between that on a more personal level was the reason why I decided to come here. So that's what I could say is that if you have interviewers who don't have the social skills and just use the number or try to start a conversation with that, you're definitely going to lose really good applicants.
Thank you. I want to finish up by asking you a couple more questions. Let's see if I can walk down uneven stairs and talk at the same time. I want to pull you a little bit more. I want to thank you very much for those fantastic comments and great discussion. It occurs to me, I want to make one comment before I wrap up. That, I've learned a lot from this whole process. I've learned a lot from this discussion. I've learned a lot from the papers. There's one thing that I'm more confused about than ever, though, and that is the term holistic, which I thought I understood before this process started. It's a word that is used universally regarding admissions. Everyone does holistic admissions, and we all brag about it. And I don't know what it means anymore, frankly. I think one definition is that we don't use just one metric. We look at multiple metrics. Well, by that definition, everyone has been doing holistic admissions forever, I think. I mean, I can't imagine there was ever a graduate program that only accepted students above an 85 percentile on the GRE or above a 3.8 GPA or whatever. There are some undergrad schools that do non-holistic admissions where they will, for example, take the top X% of every high school class, right? That's not holistic. But graduate admissions have always been holistic in that sense. You can, I think a more extreme definition is to say that, or a more strict definition or restricted definition is to say that holistic admissions means that no one element of your application will be the deciding factor. We look exclusively at the whole. And that's kind of where I thought it was. But when I really think about that, I think that implies that no single element will be the deciding factor. In other words, the GRE in a holistic process will never be the thing that tips the scales towards accept or towards decline, right? But if that's true, doesn't that mean that if you remove that aspect of the application, it would have no impact, right? If GRE scores never tip the scales one way or the other, then removing it would have no effect, in which case we're not using it at all. So I don't really have a resolution here. I'm just crying out in my confusion about what holistic means. And I'd love to hear, if anybody wants to educate me on that, I would love to hear your comments at some point. But we're getting close to the end of this 2-hour session. Thanks to you guys for sticking it out. I want to ask a couple more questions of you. Because you know I like to collect data. If you can go back to, if you could open up your browsers and go back to polev.com/PIBS. Okay. So the question is, before I ask you, the next question is going to be, having seen all this and read all this, what's your opinion about the GRE right now? But my question for you first is, what's your estimate? I'm just curious. What's your estimate about how opinions in this room have changed from spring to this moment in time? Which way do you think that, and I didn't show you the data for opinions that I collected earlier, but not knowing that, what's your sense? Are we leaning more toward the GRE or away from the GRE as a result of this whole process? There's some cynics out there. I'm not sure you're wrong, but we're going to find out. Okay.
He gave us the statistics.
Okay, so the biggest category, obviously, or by far, I should say, is no change. Okay, great. Okay, so the last question. I'm going to ask your opinion one more time. Should the GRE be required for, what is your opinion at this very moment in time? Should the GRE be required for PIBS admissions or not? Okay, well, for what it's worth, this is what the data look like in the room right now. And going back and comparing to the previous responses, it looks like basically what has happened is that those who had no opinion at the beginning of the process have tended to come down on the anti-GRE side, but not a huge change overall. I'll share these numbers with you later on, all these numbers with you later on. But thanks very much for participating in that and for participating in this discussion. That was really a respectful, open-minded discussion on all sides. I appreciate it. And I will keep you informed about this process as it goes forward. But for now, I want to respect your time, so I will let you go. And we'll keep in touch on this. Thank you.